Okay, so I want to speak about the broad theme of travel, experience, and knowledge. In the few days that Fidel Castro has died, one thing that has been recurring a few times I've noticed online is that his apologists, and that's what I think is a reasonable adjective to describe them, um, say that they have been to Cuba and that the people are all happy and it's a utopian paradise and everything is wonderful. And it got me thinking this would be a good context for talking about this subject. Firstly, directly relating to Cuba, I have no doubt that if you were to visit Havana, I've never been there myself, but I've no doubt if I were to visit Havana, I would find charming streets and charming old retro 1950s cars and very friendly people. I have no doubt the Cuban people are among the most friendly in the world. No reason to disbelieve that. But what you would not see is the prisons where an estimated 8,500 political prisoners who were arrested last year are still held. I find it one of the most incredibly naive things that there are some people who believe that just because they have traveled to a country, they know everything about it. So here's my take. I think that travel is a worthwhile experience, and I personally hope to travel to as many countries as I possibly can in my lifetime. I already feel quite privileged that I've traveled to a fair number of countries all over Western Europe, a fair bit of Central Europe, to China, to North America. So, for my age, I believe I'm reasonably well traveled, and I'm very grateful for that experience. I don't think it makes me better than anyone else, but I'm grateful for the experience. And I do hope that I have more opportunities in the future to travel. Obviously, that pertains to money because plane fares are not cheap. But yeah, I believe travel is a wonderful thing. I believe it's great to see the world. Obviously, there are certain stresses involved in terms of organizing things. There are cultural barriers and things to bear in mind. But leaving that all aside, I consider travel to be an achievement. But when people say that they've been to a country and they use that to sort of indicate that they somehow know knowledge about it. So when I hear British socialists or American socialists say, "Oh, I've been to Cuba and it was wonderful," and the people were all very happy. My question would be, do you really think the people would openly tell you that they didn't like Castro? Of course they couldn't. The whole point about dictatorships is to survive by putting on a facade. I have no doubt if you went to Gaddafi's Libya or there's many, many other examples, Idi Amin's Uganda, and you saw a selective image of those countries, you would have seen, oh, what's the big fuss about? Why are people criticizing these guys? It's wonderful. It's a utopian paradise. That's a facade. That is the whole point of dictatorships. It's how they work. They're very skilled at putting on a facade. And most dictatorships survive for that reason, because they put on this facade that it's all wonderful. In fact, I mentioned Idi Amin. The film The Last King of Scotland, of course, it's semi fictional, mostly fictional, in fact, in terms of the direct character, but it wasn't fictional in terms of Amin's paranoia and brutality. And in that film, a young Scottish doctor finds himself increasingly brought into the inner circles of Idi Amin, and he harbors this kind of romantic notion that Amin is this great freedom fighter, standing up for his people and all the rest of it. And that sort of naivety is still around today, especially among lefties. And it's pathetic. It really is. Um, and all I would say is that traveling somewhere doesn't enlighten you that much. I've been to China. I cannot say I know everything about China just because I've been there. I will say this: I met some very friendly people. I saw the best side of Chinese nature. I met some very hospitable people, some very generous people, down to earth people. There's many things I liked about China. It's a fascinating country, but that doesn't change my views, my very critical views on the Communist Party in Beijing. So I'm just making that point to exemplify what I'm driving at. That just because you visit a country doesn't mean that you're suddenly enlightened about the whole situation. People say things like, "Oh, we reject mainstream media. We'll find out for ourselves." No one can find out that much for themselves. Even frontline investigative freelance journalists can't know everything. You just unless you're omnipotent, unless you're all knowing, you cannot know everything about a given country or situation. So I just don't think that carries a great deal of weight when people say they've gone to Castro's Cuba, including shamefully Jeremy Corbyn. I don't know if he was in Cuba itself, but he is a member of the Cuban Solidarity Committee, which is basically a pro Castro group. And on the very day that Theresa May became Tory leader, 2 days before she became Prime Minister, you would think the leader of Her Majesty's opposition had better things to be doing than courting a communist group sympathetic to a communist dictator, not Jeremy Corbyn. And if there is a turning point, I was never going to vote for Corbyn anyway, but if there was a turning point, it was his pathetic praise of Castro yesterday. He only mentioned human rights once. He'd done about 2 or 3 interviews. All of them were gushing praise on Castro. 90% of the rhetoric. He very briefly touched on the human rights and free speech issue. But this is a man who, since his leadership of the Labour Party, it has attracted, in my opinion, a lot of hard right people. Hard left people. Hard to tell the difference nowadays, to be quite honest. But there's unquestionably communists in Labour ranks these days, and they're committing political suicide. If Jeremy Corbyn wins the next general election, I will eat my jumper. It isn't going to happen. Because people like Jeremy Corbyn cling on to a failed ideology, which is that particular type of so-called anti-imperialist socialism. It isn't actually about freedom at all. It's the exact opposite. I mean, there was no freedom for the minorities that Castro persecuted. And I believe in the years that come, his excesses will be revealed even more. I also wonder what the future of Cuba will be. Obviously, Raul Castro is now in power. He's not as excessive as his brother. He certainly doesn't carry the same sort of cultural weight among left wingers. And he's in his mid 80s. So, presumably, when he passes in a few years, Cuba's going to be in a very interesting situation. For what it's worth, I don't actually want to see Cuba become just a semblance of Florida or another American state. I don't particularly want to see McDonald's on every corner. I hope Cuba does retain a strong aspect of its Cuban culture. The I'm talking purely cultural things here, Cuban music, the retro architecture, all that sort of stuff. I don't want to see that go. I don't want to see Cuba become just a template of another American state. But I do want to see a Cuba that has improved human rights, free expression. Um, what direction Trump's going to take. Obviously, he's talking hard at the moment, but I don't know what direction he's going to take. Anyway, I'm going to round this up as I'm going off on a tangent now. All I'm going to say is travel experience is important. It's good. It's an achievement. But no one can say that they know a country 100% just because they've traveled there. Even living in a country, I have. I've lived in China for 6 months. So I can't say I know China inside out. I think even if you live in a country for 10 years, I could live in China for 10 years and I could say that I know it well. I couldn't claim that I know everything. Because unless you're God, you're not going to know everything. So, what I would politely say to those people who visit Cuba and say it's a paradise, all I would say is you're seeing the facade. Even if people, those Cubans who don't like Castro are hardly going to tell you, and they're hardly going to show you the prisons where dissidents are kept. The situation may be improving now under his brother, marginally, but it's a facade, and that's it. So people need to stop being so naive and thinking that just because they travel, it somehow makes them experts. It doesn't. I'm well traveled, and I don't claim to be an expert on anything. Certainly not on knowing a country inside out. That's all I'm saying. Don't be so naive.